The auctioneer's voice, amplified and distorted by the PA system, bounced off the corrugated steel of the barn. Dust motes danced in the late afternoon sun, illuminating the circling crowd like a spotlight on their collective misfortune. It was 1974, a summer clinging to the last threads of optimism before the storm rolled in, and the air hung thick with the smell of diesel and desperation. Cletus Johnson, a man built like an oak and weathered like saddle leather, leaned against the fender of his Farmall M, its faded red paint a testament to years of honest work. He watched as another piece of the Hemlock farm, a meticulously maintained John Deere 420, went to the highest bidder, a slick city type in a suit that looked entirely out of place amidst the overalls and dirt-caked boots. Across the dusty yard, perched atop the gleaming cab of his brand-new International Harvester, 1466, sat Dale Earnhardt. No relation to the race car driver, though he fancied himself just as fast. Dale was Hemlock's neighbor, and he'd been circling the carcass of the Hemlock farm like a vulture for months, eager to pick up the pieces. He wore a smug grin, the kind that only comes from easy money and a lack of understanding of the land. Cletus didn't begrudge Dale his success, not exactly, but he resented the way Dale flaunted it, the way he seemed to take pleasure in Hemlock's misfortune. Hemlock had been a good man, a hard worker, but he'd gotten caught up in the promises of bigger yields and easy credit, a siren song that had lured too many farmers to the rocks. The auctioneer's voice crackled again, announcing the next item, a 1968 Massey Ferguson 510 Combine. It was a decent machine, well maintained, but its age showed. Cletus knew it well. He'd helped Hemlock work on it more than once. "Now, folks," the auctioneer drawled, "this here's a good old machine. She's seen some acres, but she's got plenty of life left in her. Who'll give me 5,000? The bidding was slow, hesitant. The Massey Ferguson wasn't exactly cutting-edge technology. It lacked the fancy features of Dale's new IH 1466, the automatic header control, the sophisticated grain loss monitors, the air-conditioned cab. In 1974, it looked like a relic. Cletus could practically hear Dale's silent laughter. He could almost feel the weight of the community's judgment, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Why was Cletus still clinging to his old equipment when everyone else was upgrading? Cletus knew what they were thinking. They saw his Farmall M, his Ford 8N tractor, his aging New Holland haybine, and they saw a man stuck in the past, a man who was too stubborn to embrace progress. They saw a man who was destined to be left behind. But Cletus saw something different. He saw machines that were paid for, machines that he knew inside and out, machines that had served him well for years. He saw freedom from debt, freedom from the relentless pressure to produce more and more, freedom to farm his land the way he saw fit. The bidding stalled at 3,500. The auctioneer looked disappointed. "Come on, folks, don't let this one get away. 3,500. Do I hear 36? Dale Earnhardt chuckled, a low rumble that carried across the yard. "Looks like that old girl's seen better days," he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Probably cost more to keep her running than she's worth." Cletus felt a surge of anger, but he kept it in check. He knew Dale was trying to bait him, trying to provoke him into a bidding war. He wouldn't give him the satisfaction. The auctioneer was about to drop the hammer when a voice rang out from the back of the crowd. 4,000! Everyone turned to see who had spoken. It was Martha Hemlock, Hemlock's widow, her face pale but resolute. She stood tall, her chin held high, defying the pitying glances of the onlookers. A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. They knew Martha was struggling to keep her head above water. They knew she couldn't afford to overspend. Dale Earnhardt's grin widened. He knew he had her now. 4,500, he shouted. Martha hesitated, her eyes darting around the crowd. She looked lost, vulnerable. Cletus couldn't stand it any longer. He stepped forward, his jaw tight. 5,000, he said, his voice clear and steady. The crowd gasped. Dale Earnhardt's smile vanished. He stared at Cletus, his eyes narrowed with disbelief. "Cletus," Martha said, her voice trembling. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," Cletus replied, his gaze fixed on Dale. 5,000. And that's my final offer. Dale hesitated. He knew Cletus was serious. He knew Cletus wouldn't back down. He also knew that Cletus didn't have much money. He probably couldn't afford to go much higher. But Dale couldn't resist the challenge. He couldn't bear the thought of being outbid by Cletus, of being shown up by a man who was still farming with equipment that belonged in a museum. 5,500, he roared. Cletus paused, his hand resting on the fender of his Farmall M. He looked at Martha, her face etched with worry. He looked at Dale, his face flushed with triumph. He knew he couldn't win. He didn't have the money, but he also knew he couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. 6,000, he said, his voice barely a whisper. The crowd was silent, holding its breath. Dale Earnhardt's face turned purple with rage. He knew he'd been had. He knew Cletus had called his bluff. He could go higher, of course. He could easily outbid Cletus. But he also knew that he'd be paying far more than the combine was worth. He'd be letting Cletus manipulate him, control him. He couldn't stand it. He threw his hands up in the air. Fine, he spat. Take it. It's not worth that much anyway. The auctioneer slammed the gavel down. Sold to Cletus Johnson for $6,000. A smattering of applause rippled through the crowd. Martha Hemlock rushed over to Cletus, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she sobbed. "Thank you, Cletus. I don't know what I would have done." Cletus put his arm around her, his heart aching for her loss. He knew he'd just spent a significant chunk of his savings, money he'd been carefully hoarding for years. He knew he'd probably made a mistake, but he also knew he'd done the right thing. He'd stood up to Dale Earnhardt. He'd shown the community that he wasn't afraid to fight for what he believed in. And he'd given Martha Hemlock a little bit of hope, a little bit of breathing room. As he drove the Massey Ferguson back to his farm, the setting sun casting long shadows across the fields, Cletus couldn't help but wonder if he'd made the right decision. He knew the combine was old, and he knew it would require a lot of work to keep it running. But he also knew that it was a good machine, a reliable machine. And he knew that, with a little bit of luck and a lot of hard work, he could make it pay for itself. Before we go further, let me ask you something. Think back to the farms of your family, or the farms you knew growing up. What was that one piece of old equipment that everyone thought was destined for the scrap heap, but somehow kept going year after year? Drop a comment below and tell me about it. The first few years were tough. The Massey Ferguson was constantly breaking down. The grain head would clog with weeds, the engine would overheat, and the belts would snap at the most inopportune moments. Cletus spent countless hours in the sweltering heat, wrestling with rusty bolts and greasy parts, trying to keep the old machine running. Dale Earnhardt, of course, never missed an opportunity to gloat. He'd drive by Cletus's fields in his air-conditioned IH 1466, a cloud of dust billowing behind him, and he'd wave mockingly. "Having trouble, Cletus?" he'd yell. "Maybe you should trade that old thing in for something a little more modern." Cletus would just smile and wave back, his face grimy with sweat and oil. He knew Dale was trying to get under his skin, but he wouldn't let him. He knew that Dale's fancy new combine was costing him a fortune in loan payments, insurance, and fuel. He knew that Dale was sacrificing his independence for the sake of bigger yields and faster harvests. Cletus preferred his way. He preferred the satisfaction of fixing his own equipment, of relying on his own skills and ingenuity. He preferred the freedom of knowing that he didn't owe anyone anything. But even Cletus had to admit that it was getting harder and harder to compete. The price of fuel was skyrocketing, the cost of fertilizer was soaring, and the interest rates on farm loans were climbing steadily. The early 1970s boom was starting to fade, and the storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. He remembered one particularly brutal harvest season in 1976. The Massey Ferguson broke down 3 times in 1 week, each time requiring hours of painstaking repair. Cletus was working from dawn till dusk, pushing himself to the limit. One evening, as he was lying under the combine, his body aching and his hands covered in grease, he heard a voice above him. It was his son, Billy, who was 10 years old at the time. "Dad," Billy said, "why don't we just get a new combine, like Dale Earnhardt's?" Cletus sighed. He knew Billy didn't understand. He knew Billy just wanted to make things easier, to take some of the burden off his father's shoulders. "Billy," Cletus said, "a new combine costs a lot of money. Money we don't have. Besides, this old combine is a good machine. It's just temperamental." "But Dad," Billy persisted, "it's always breaking down. It's embarrassing." Cletus sat up and looked at his son. He saw the shame in his eyes, the feeling of being different, of being less than the other kids. He knew he had to explain it to him, to make him understand. "Billy," he said, "there's more to farming than just having the newest equipment. It's about hard work, it's about perseverance, it's about taking care of the land, and it's about being independent, about not owing anyone anything." "But Dad," Billy said, "what's the point of being independent if we're always struggling? What's the point of working hard if we're never going to get ahead?" Cletus didn't have an answer to that question. He didn't know what the point was. All he knew was that he couldn't give up. He couldn't let Dale Earnhardt win. He couldn't let his son down. He put his hand on Billy's shoulder. "We'll get through this, son," he said. "We always do." But deep down, Cletus wasn't so sure. He could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of the debt, the relentless grind of the work. He could see the future stretching out before him, a future of endless toil and uncertainty. He just hoped he could hold on long enough to see Billy grow up, to see him make something of himself. He hoped he could provide for his family, to give them a better life than he had. He hoped he could keep the farm afloat, to preserve the legacy of his ancestors. But as the 1970s wore on, those hopes began to fade. The economy worsened, the interest rates soared, and the price of land plummeted. Farmers all across the Midwest were facing foreclosure, their dreams shattered, their lives ruined. Dale Earnhardt, however, seemed to be thriving. He bought up more and more land, he invested in the latest technology, and he expanded his operation at an alarming rate. He seemed to be immune to the economic downturn, untouchable, invincible. Cletus watched him with a mixture of envy and resentment. He knew Dale was taking advantage of the situation, preying on the misfortune of others. He knew Dale was sacrificing his community for the sake of his own ambition. But he also knew that Dale was winning. He was succeeding where Cletus was failing. He was building an empire while Cletus was struggling to survive. By 1979, Cletus was barely holding on. He'd mortgaged his farm to the hilt, he'd sold off some of his equipment, and he'd taken on a part-time job at the local grain elevator. He was working harder than ever, but he was still falling further behind. One cold, grey morning in November, Cletus was sitting in his kitchen, staring at a pile of unpaid bills. His wife, Sarah, came in and sat down beside him. "Cletus," she said, her voice soft, "we need to talk." Cletus knew what she was going to say. He'd been expecting it for months. "I know," he said. We can't keep going on like this." "We need to sell the farm," Sarah said. "It's the only way out." Cletus felt a pang of grief, a sharp, stabbing pain in his chest. He'd never imagined that it would come to this. He'd always believed that he could weather any storm, that he could overcome any obstacle. But he knew Sarah was right. They had no choice. "Okay," he said, his voice barely audible. "Okay, we'll sell the farm." Sarah reached out and took his hand. "I'm so sorry, Cletus," she said. "I know how much this means to you." Cletus squeezed her hand. "It's not your fault, Sarah," he said. "It's nobody's fault. It's just the way things are." But deep down, Cletus knew that wasn't true. He knew that someone was to blame. He knew that the system was rigged against the small farmer, that the banks and the corporations were conspiring to drive them out of business. He knew that Dale Earnhardt was part of that system. He was a cog in the machine, a willing accomplice in the destruction of the family farm. As Cletus sat there, holding his wife's hand, he made a vow. He vowed that he wouldn't give up. He vowed that he would find a way to survive, to rebuild his life. He vowed that he would never let Dale Earnhardt win. The winter of 1979-1980 was one of the coldest and most brutal on record. The snow fell relentlessly, the temperatures plummeted, and the wind howled like a banshee. The farm seemed to be frozen in time, a desolate wasteland of ice and snow. Cletus spent most of his days inside, huddled by the fire, trying to stay warm. He couldn't bring himself to go out to the barn, to look at the equipment that he would soon have to sell. He couldn't bear the thought of leaving the farm, of abandoning the land that he loved. One day, as he was sitting by the fire, he heard a knock on the door. He opened it to find Dale Earnhardt standing there, a smug look on his face. "Cletus," Dale said, "I heard you're selling the farm. I'm sorry to hear that." Cletus stared at him, his eyes filled with anger. He knew Dale wasn't sorry. He knew Dale was gloating. "What do you want, Dale?" Cletus asked. "I just wanted to make you an offer," Dale said. "I'm willing to buy your farm. I'll give you a fair price." Cletus hesitated. He knew he shouldn't sell to Dale. He knew Dale would just tear down the house, bulldoze the fields, and turn the farm into another sterile industrial operation. But he also knew that he didn't have any other options. He needed the money. "Okay," he said. "Okay, I'll sell you the farm." Dale smiled. "Good," he said. "I'll draw up the papers. We can close the deal next week." He turned to leave, but Cletus stopped him. "Dale," Cletus said, "there's one thing I want you to know." Dale turned back, his eyebrows raised. "You may have won this battle," Cletus said, "but you haven't won the war. I'll be back. I'll find a way to get my farm back. And when I do, you'll be sorry." Dale laughed. "Don't hold your breath, Cletus," he said. "You're finished. You're washed up. You're never going to amount to anything." He turned and walked away, leaving Cletus standing in the doorway, his heart filled with rage and despair. As Dale drove away in his brand-new pickup truck, Cletus looked out across his snow-covered fields. He knew that he was facing the greatest challenge of his life. He knew that he had a long and difficult road ahead of him, but he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had his family, his friends, and his faith. And he had the memory of his ancestors, the farmers who had toiled on this land for generations. He knew that they were watching him, urging him on. He knew that they wouldn't want him to give up. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and walked back inside. He had work to do. He had a life to rebuild. He had a promise to keep. He would get his farm back. He would make Dale Earnhardt pay. And he would prove to everyone that the family farm was not dead, that it could still thrive in the modern world. The seeds of his resolve were planted, even as the landscape around him lay dormant, waiting for the spring. Ot 4. The turning point. The early 1980s were a blur of hard labor and grim determination. Cletus, now working full-time at the grain elevator, spent his evenings and weekends scrounging. He wasn't just licking his wounds, he was actively hunting for a way back. He took on odd jobs, repairing farm equipment for neighbors, hauling hay, even some carpentry work. Sarah took a job at the local diner, her cheerful disposition a balm to the weary souls who frequented the place. Billy, now a teenager, helped out wherever he could, learning the value of a hard day's work firsthand. The signs of crisis were everywhere. The drought of '83 was particularly brutal. Fields turned to dust, and the corn withered on the stalk. Even Dale Earnhardt, with his irrigation systems and deep pockets, couldn't escape the devastation entirely. Commodity prices plummeted, and the banks, already nervous, started tightening to the screws. Foreclosures became commonplace. The once vibrant farming community was slowly being strangled. Dale, despite his earlier success, was starting to feel the pinch. His massive operation, built on borrowed money, was now a liability. The interest rates on his loans were astronomical. The new equipment that had once been his pride and joy was now a burden. The sophisticated electronics in his International Harvester 1466, designed for peak efficiency, were proving to be surprisingly fragile and expensive to repair. The combine's solid-state ignition system, for example, was prone to failure, and the replacement parts were back-ordered for weeks. The automatic header control, while impressive, required constant calibration and often malfunctioned, leading to uneven cutting and grain loss. Cletus, on the other hand, was faring surprisingly well. He had no debt, he had his skills, and he had a secret weapon, the Massey Ferguson 5-10. While other farmers were struggling to afford the fuel and repairs for their modern machines, Cletus was chugging along, harvesting what little crop there was with his trusty old combine. He'd become a master at keeping it running, improvising repairs with ingenuity and salvaged parts. He knew every bolt, every belt, every bearing. He understood the machine's limitations, but he also knew its strengths. He'd even replaced the original Continental six-cylinder gas engine with a more fuel-efficient Perkins diesel he'd salvaged from an old gravel truck, a modification that raised eyebrows but significantly lowered his operating costs. One sweltering afternoon, Cletus was helping a neighbor repair a broken hydraulic line on his John Deere 4440 tractor. The neighbor, a young man named Tom, was clearly distraught. He was facing foreclosure, and he didn't know what to do. "I just can't keep up, Cletus," Tom said, wiping sweat from his brow. "The bank wants their money, and I don't have it. I thought I was doing the right thing, upgrading to the latest equipment. But now I'm ruined." Cletus nodded sympathetically. "I know how you feel, Tom," he said. "But don't give up. There's always a way." He paused, then added, "You know, I've been thinking, maybe all this new technology isn't all it's cracked up to be. It's complicated, it's expensive, and it breaks down all the time. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways." Tom looked at Cletus skeptically. "But how can you compete without the latest equipment?" he asked. "How can you get the yields you need to make a profit?" Cletus smiled. "You don't need to get the highest yields," he said. "You just need to get enough, and you need to do it without going into debt." He pointed to his Farmall M, parked nearby. "That old tractor's been working for me for years," he said. "It's not fancy, but it's reliable, and it's paid for." He then gestured towards the Massey Ferguson, rumbling in the distance. "And that old combine? Well, it might look foolish, but it's getting the job done. and it's not costing me an arm and a leg to operate." Tom looked thoughtful. He was starting to see Cletus's point. Maybe there was another way, a way to survive without sacrificing everything. That evening, as Cletus was driving home from the grain elevator, he saw Dale Earnhardt's International Harvester 1466 parked on the side of the road, its hood open. Dale was standing beside it, looking frustrated and defeated. Cletus pulled over. "Trouble, Dale?" he asked, trying to keep the satisfaction out of his voice. Dale glared at him. "None of your business, Cletus," he snapped. "Just trying to be neighborly," Cletus said. "Maybe I can help." Dale hesitated, then sighed. "It's the damn ignition system," he said. "It's gone out again, and the dealer says they don't have the parts. I'm losing valuable time." Cletus knew a little about those early solid-state ignition systems, prone to heat soak and finicky to diagnose. He walked over to the tractor and took a look. After a few minutes of tinkering, he straightened up. "I think I know what's wrong," he said. "It's probably just a loose connection. I can fix it for you." Dale looked surprised. "You can?" he asked. "But you don't have any of the special tools." Cletus smiled. "I don't need special tools," he said. "I just need a little bit of know-how." He rummaged through his toolbox and pulled out a pair of pliers and a screwdriver. He quickly tightened the loose connection, and the tractor sputtered to life. Dale stared at him in disbelief. I don't understand," he said. "How did you do that?" Cletus shrugged. "Just a little bit of old-fashioned ingenuity," he said. "Sometimes the simplest solutions are the best." Dale looked humbled, defeated. He knew that Cletus had just saved him a lot of time and money. He also knew that Cletus had just proven him wrong. "Thanks, Cletus," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I appreciate it." Cletus nodded. "Anytime, Dale," he said. "Anytime." As Cletus drove away, he couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. He had finally shown Dale Earnhardt that his fancy new equipment wasn't everything. He had shown him that skill, ingenuity, and hard work were still valuable assets, and he had shown him that the old ways still had a place in the modern world. The tide was turning. Act 5. The Crisis. By 1985, the agricultural crisis had reached its peak. Bank interest rates soared to unprecedented levels, reaching as high as 20%. Farmers who had borrowed heavily to expand their operations were now facing crippling debt payments. Foreclosures became a daily occurrence. The once proud farming community was crumbling under the weight of economic hardship. Dale Earnhardt's empire was collapsing. His massive debt load, combined with the plummeting commodity prices and the rising interest rates, had pushed him to the brink. He was forced to sell off pieces of his land, his equipment, and even his house. His once gleaming International Harvester, 1466, now battered and worn, sat idle in the shed, a symbol of his shattered dreams. Cletus, on the other hand, was weathering the storm. He had no debt, he had his skills, and he had his trusty old equipment. He was able to continue farming, albeit on a smaller scale, and he was even able to help some of his neighbors who were struggling. He offered them his equipment, his expertise, and his support. He became a beacon of hope in a community that was desperately in need of it. One bitterly cold morning, Cletus received a phone call from the bank. They informed him that Dale Earnhardt's farm was going up for auction. They wanted to know if Cletus was interested in bidding. Cletus hesitated. He had mixed feelings about Dale. He resented him for his arrogance and his greed, but he also felt a twinge of sympathy for him. He knew that Dale had made mistakes, but he also knew that he was a victim of the system. After a moment of reflection, Cletus made a decision. He decided to attend the auction. He didn't know if he would bid, but he wanted to be there to witness the outcome. The auction was a somber affair. The crowd was small and subdued. The air was thick with tension and despair. Dale Earnhardt stood off to the side, his face pale and drawn. He looked like a broken man. The auctioneer started the bidding. The prices were low, reflecting the depressed state of the market. Cletus watched as piece after piece of Dale's farm was sold off, each sale driving another nail into the coffin of his dreams. Finally, the auctioneer announced that the last item to be sold was the farmhouse itself. The bidding was slow and hesitant. The house was old and run down, and it needed a lot of work. Cletus looked at Dale. He saw the pain in his eyes, the devastation in his face. He knew that losing the farmhouse would be the final blow, the ultimate humiliation. On impulse, Cletus raised his hand. "I'll bid," he said, his voice clear and steady. The crowd gasped. Dale Earnhardt stared at him in disbelief. The bidding continued, but Cletus was determined. He kept raising his hand, pushing the price higher and higher. Finally, the auctioneer slammed the gavel down. "Sold to Cletus Johnson for $50,000. The crowd erupted in applause. Dale Earnhardt rushed over to Cletus, tears streaming down his face. "Cletus," he sobbed. Why did you do this?" Cletus put his arm around Dale's shoulder. "Because it's the right thing to do, Dale," he said. "Because you're still my neighbor, and because we're all in this together." He paused, then added, "Besides, Dale, I have a proposition for you." He explained his idea. He wanted to offer Dale a chance to stay on the farm, to work for him as a farm manager. He would pay him a fair wage, and he would give him a share of the profits. Dale looked stunned. He couldn't believe that Cletus was offering him a second chance. You'd really do that for me, Cletus?" he asked. Cletus smiled. "Of course, Dale," he said. "Everyone deserves a second chance." Dale hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, Cletus," he said. "I'll do it. I'll work for you." Cletus smiled. He knew that he had made the right decision. He had not only saved Dale Earnhardt from ruin, but he had also helped to heal the community. Act 6. Vindication and Legacy. The years that followed were a period of healing and rebuilding. Cletus and Dale worked side by side, restoring the farm to its former glory. Cletus, with his old-fashioned skills and his debt-free operation, provided the stability and the foundation. Dale, with his knowledge of modern farming techniques, brought new ideas and new energy to the operation. Together, they transformed the farm into a model of sustainable agriculture. They diversified their crops, they implemented soil conservation practices, and they reduced their reliance on chemical fertilizers and pesticides. They proved that it was possible to be both profitable and environmentally responsible. The community began to shift its perspective. People started to realize that Cletus had been right all along. They started to appreciate the value of hard work, ingenuity, and independence. They started to question the wisdom of chasing after the latest technology and the highest yields. Cletus became a local hero. He was respected and admired for his integrity, his compassion, and his unwavering commitment to the community. He was often asked to speak at local events, sharing his wisdom and his experiences with others. One evening, as Cletus was sitting on his porch watching the sunset, Billy came out and sat down beside him. Billy was now a young man, a successful engineer. He had moved away from the farm to pursue his career, but he often came back to visit. "Dad," Billy said, "I've been thinking a lot about what you told me when I was a kid. About the importance of hard work, independence, and taking care of the land." Cletus smiled. "And what have you concluded?" he asked. "I've concluded that you were right," Billy said. "You were right about everything. I've seen firsthand how the pursuit of money and power can corrupt people. I've seen how technology can be used to exploit and destroy. And I've realized that the things that really matter in life are the things that you can't buy: family, friends, community, and a connection to the land. Cletus nodded. "Those are wise words, son," he said. "Those are wise words." He paused, then added, "You know, Billy, I'm not going to be around forever. One day, you're going to have to take over the farm." Billy looked surprised. "But Dad," he said, "I'm an engineer. I don't know anything about farming." Cletus smiled. "You'll learn," he said. "You're a Johnson. It's in your blood." He put his hand on Billy's shoulder. "And besides," he said, "you'll have Dale to help you. He's a good man, and he knows this land better than anyone." Billy smiled. He knew that his father was right. He knew that he could handle it. Years passed. Cletus lived a long and fulfilling life, surrounded by his family and his friends. He continued to farm the land, passing on his knowledge and his wisdom to the next generation. Dale Earnhardt remained on the farm, working alongside Billy. He became a respected member of the community, known for his honesty, his hard work, and his dedication to the land. The Massey Ferguson 510, patched and repainted countless times, continued to harvest the fields, a symbol of resilience and ingenuity. It was a reminder that the old ways still had value, that the simplest solutions were often the best, and that the human spirit could overcome any obstacle. In his later years, Cletus often reflected on his life. He had faced many challenges, many setbacks, and many disappointments, but he had also experienced great joy, great love, and great satisfaction. He had learned that the most important things in life were not material possessions, but rather the relationships that he had built with others. He had learned that true success was not measured by wealth or power, but rather by the positive impact that he had had on the world. And he had learned that even the most foolish-looking decisions could sometimes lead to the most unexpected and rewarding outcomes. That paid-off combine, the one that looked so foolish in 1974, had ultimately saved the land, the community, and the legacy of the Johnson family. As Cletus closed his eyes for the final time, he felt a sense of peace and contentment. He knew that he had lived a good life. He knew that he had made a difference, and he knew that his legacy would live on long after he was gone. The fields whispered his name on the wind, a testament to a life well lived, a land well loved, and a lesson well learned. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways, especially when they're born of necessity, ingenuity, and a deep connection to the land. And sometimes the most foolish-looking decisions are the ones that save us all.